All right, so we'll be seeing in today's session on the meninges, okay, and the ventricles of the brain. Okay, the meninges. Okay, we know that the brain and spinal cord, they are covered by meninges. Okay, so they are covered by meninges. From outside to inwards, this is dura mater, arachnoid matter, and pia mater. Okay, so from outside to inwards, or from inside outwards, it is brain. Just above the brain will be pia mater, then arachnoid matter, and dura mater. Now, between the dura mater and the arachnoid matter, there is a space. Okay, and this space, it is called as subdural space. Sub means below. It is present below the dura mater. So this is called as subdural space between the dura mater and the arachnoid matter. Now, between the arachnoid matter and pia matter, there is another space which is called as subarachnoid space. Okay, so just below the arachnoid matter, so that's why it's called as subarachnoid space. Now, this is the space which contains the cerebrospinal fluid, CSF. Okay, CSF or cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid is a very important fluid which helps in giving nutrition to the brain, the neurons, and they collect the waste materials also from the brain. Okay, the carbon dioxide, oxygen, carbon dioxide, because some parts of the brain, the blood cannot go directly. So the nutrition, it goes through the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so here you can see. So this is the picture showing the meninges. Okay, the meninges. So let me see what are all here. This is the skull. Okay, and this is the cerebral cortex. Okay, and here you can see the outermost layer, which is the dura mater. Okay, the dura mater. Okay, which is here, located here. Okay, the arachnoid matter, the green colored part, which is the arachnoid matter, just below the dura mater. Okay, the pia mater is so thin, and it is usually going along firmly, slightly attached to the cerebral cortex. Okay, to the brain. Okay, it follows the brain convolutions, the pia mater. Okay, so below the arachnoid matter, in the subarachnoid space, okay, is the presence of the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, the dura mater, it is a dense fibrous, it is very thick. Okay, it is made up of fibrous tissue, and it forms layers between the brain. One is called as falx cerebri, falx cerebelli, and tentorium cerebelli. Now let's see each one of them. You can see the dura mater is partially dividing the two cerebral hemispheres. Okay, so this is called as falx cerebri. Okay, falx cerebri. Okay, the dura mater also divides the two cerebellum. Okay, the two cerebellar hemispheres. Okay, and that is called as falx cerebelli. Okay, this is falx cerebri, falx cerebelli. Okay, there is another one which divides the cerebrum from the cerebellum. That is called as tentorium cerebelli. Okay, so the two cerebellar hemispheres, the two cerebral hemispheres, they are separated by falx cerebri. The two cerebellar hemispheres, they are separated by falx cerebelli, and the cerebrum and the cerebellum, they are separated by tentorium cerebellum. Okay, now along this falx cerebri, on the superior aspect of it, you can see a venous channel, and this is called as superior sagittal sinus. Okay, it is a venous channel. We have seen about the arteries in cerebrum. Okay, but the venous channel we have not seen in detail. We have seen in the cardiovascular model. Okay, only a few of them we have seen. So we will be seeing it here in detail. So along this falx cerebri, on the superior border, there is a vein which is called a superior sagittal sinus, and there is one on the inferior aspect. So what do you call this as? This is superior sagittal sinus. So
Okay,
this one
windows.
is inferior sagittal sinus. Okay, inferior sagittal sinus. This is superior sagittal sinus. So this one is inferior sagittal sinus. Okay, so this one is inferior sagittal sinus. Okay, the inferior sagittal sinus. Now what happens to this inferior sagittal sinus? The inferior sagittal sinus, if you see, it drains into another one straight sinus. Okay, it drains into this straight sinus. Okay, it goes into the straight sinus. Now this straight sinus, the superior sagittal sinus, they both join together. They both join together and then they go along the top of the tentorium cerebellum. Okay, okay, they go along the top of the tentorium cerebelli, and that's called as sigmoid sinus. Okay, it's called as sigmoid sinus. Sigmoid. Okay, sigmoid sinus. So this one is the superior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus. The inferior sagittal sinus continues as the straight sinus. The straight sinus joins with the superior sagittal sinus, okay, and continues laterally as the sigmoid sinus. Okay, the sigmoid sinus. Okay, any doubts? Okay, so here we are seeing those things in detail again. So this is the superior sagittal sinus and this is the inferior sagittal sinus. Okay, the inferior sagittal sinus continues as the straight sinus. The straight sinus continues as the transverse sinus. The transverse sinus then continues down as the sigmoid sinus. Okay, the sigmoid sinus. Okay, so these are the venous drainage of the brain. Okay, superior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus, straight sinus, transverse sinus, and then the sigmoid sinus. Now let's see the ventricles. Okay, the ventricles, these are cavities which are present in the brain. Okay, and they contain a fluid which is called as cerebrospinal fluid. Each cerebral hemisphere will be having a cavity which is called as right and left lateral ventricles. Okay, so here you can see a C-shaped structure. So this is a lateral ventricle present in one cerebral hemisphere. Similarly, there will be a there will be a cavity in the other cerebral hemisphere. Okay, so both are called as lateral ventricles. Okay, the right cerebral hemisphere, the right lateral ventricle is there, and in the left one, the left lateral ventricle is there. Now these two ventricles, they join together at this place, which is called as foramen of Monro. Okay, foramen of Monro. So the two lateral ventricles, they join together. Okay, and the cerebrospinal fluid from there, they come through the foramen of Monro into the third ventricle. Okay, they go into the third ventricle. Okay, and from the third ventricle, it goes into the fourth ventricle. Okay, you can see the fourth ventricle located between the pons. Okay, the pons, midbrain, and the cerebellum. Okay, the fourth ventricle. Okay, the fourth ventricle is connected to the third ventricle by cerebral aqueduct or aqueduct of Sylvius. Okay, cerebral aqueduct or aqueduct of Sylvius. Then what happens? From the fourth ventricle, the cerebrospinal fluid continues down as the central canal of the spinal cord. Okay, the central canal of the spinal cord. Okay, so this is with regard to the ventricles. There are two lateral ventricles. The two lateral ventricles are connected by foramen of Monro. Okay, then from there it goes to the third ventricle. From the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle through cerebral aqueduct or aqueduct of Sylvius. Okay, and from the fourth ventricle it continues down as the central canal of the spinal cord. Okay, any doubts until now?
The lateral and the third ventricle is connected by which?
The lateral ventricle, the two lateral ventricles are connected by the interventricular foramen of Monro. Okay, and from the interventricular foramen, it goes into the third ventricle. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Now where is the CSF formed from? The CSF, it is formed from, here you can see some small red colored structures. Okay, you can see some small red colored structures, right? Okay, you can see some red colored structures along the lateral ventricle, the third ventricle, and partially in the fourth ventricle. So it is produced from here. Okay, if it is produced inside the brain, how does it
Doctor, we can't hear you.
Sorry, it got disconnected. Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, doctor.
All right. So we have seen the two lateral ventricles, the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle. The lateral ventricles are joined by foramen of Monro. Okay, and from the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle, it goes through the cerebral aqueduct. Now here you can see uh, there are uh, there are cerebrospinal fluid outside the brain as well. Okay, so how come the cerebrospinal fluid, which is produced inside the brain, comes outside? Okay, there will be connections from the fourth ventricle to the subarachnoid space. Okay, so there will be some connections from the fourth ventricle to the subarachnoid space. Okay, so through this it goes to the subarachnoid space of the brain. Okay, so here you can see the lateral ventricles which is present in each cerebral hemisphere. They are connected by the interventricular foramen to the third ventricle. Okay, the interventricular foramen of Monro. Okay, the interventricular foramen of Monro. excuse me, the third ventricle, which is situated below the interventricular foramen and is between the two thalamus. It communicates with the fourth ventricle through cerebral aqueduct or aqueduct of Sylvius. Okay, the fourth ventricle. The fourth ventricle is more or less like a diamond shape and is situated between the cerebellum and pons. We already know that. Okay, between the pons and cerebellum. Okay, we have studied, right? Behind the pons there is cerebellum. Okay, and then this continues down as the central canal of the spinal cord. Now, CSF is produced. Where is it produced? By vascular structures called choroid plexus. So here you can see in this picture there are some red colored shaded portions. Okay, they are present in the lateral ventricle, the third ventricle, and the fourth ventricle. So the CSF is produced here. The cerebrospinal fluid is produced by choroid plexus. Okay. Now, what happens if they keep on producing? There needs to be absorbed, right? So there needs to be like a heart. Okay, so they need to be pumping inside the blood and pumping out of the blood. Okay, so similarly, the CSF pumping in is done by this choroid plexus. Now, what is the one which absorbs? The absorption is by tiny projections of arachnoid matter into the venous sinuses. Okay, so what happens? The arachnoid matter, you know, dura matter, arachnoid matter, and pia matter, right? The arachnoid matter protrudes into the venous sinuses. Okay, they protrude inside the venous sinuses. That is usually the superior sagittal sinus. Okay, and this is called as arachnoid granulations. Okay, the arachnoid granulations. The next one, from the fourth ventricle, the CSF passes to the subarachnoid space from the fourth ventricle. Okay, so from the fourth ventricle, how does it passes outside the subarachnoid space? There are two more foramens here, foramen of Meninges and foramen of Luschka. Okay, foramen of Meninges and foramen of Luschka. So they help in transferring the CSF from the fourth ventricle to the subarachnoid space. You'll see the pictures. So here you can see the lateral ventricle, interventricular foramen of Monroe, the third ventricle, aqueduct of Sylvius, the fourth ventricle, which is continuous down as the central canal. Okay, and in this picture, you can see the brain. This is the subarachnoid cavity. Okay, the falx cerebri, the pia mater, the arachnoid matter. Okay, the green color structure is the arachnoid matter, and you can see the arachnoid matter is protruding inside the sagittal sinus. Is protruding inside the sagittal sinus. Okay, this is called as arachnoid granulations. Okay, so this is where the CSF is absorbed. Okay, the CSF production is by choroid plexus and the absorption is by arachnoid granulations. Okay, from the fourth ventricle, it goes out through the magenta, through the foramen of Meninges and foramen of Luschka. Okay, so this is another picture showing the different foramens as well as the ventricles. Okay, but this is in German, but you can make it like some of the parts. So here you can see the lateral ventricles. This is the interventricular foramen or foramen of Monroe. This is the third ventricle, and from the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle through the aqueduct of Sylvius. Okay, and from the aqueduct of from the fourth ventricle, it goes into the subarachnoid space through foramen of Meninges and foramen of Luschka. All right. Any doubts?
No, doctor.